In the snowy courtyard of Northgate Academy, a soft-spoken scholarship student was about to face the brutal weight of tradition and cruelty. What started as a quiet walk to the dining hall took a shocking turn when she was cornered, and her uniform was ripped in front of the entire school. Riya Sharma wasn't your typical transfer student. For nearly a decade, she had trained under the stern discipline of her ex-military grandfather, mastering taekwondo with the precision of a soldier and the heart of a protector, when she encountered Beau Whitman, Northgate's rugby captain, mocking her heritage and status. She had no idea she was walking into a war of pride and power. Riya didn't strike back, not at first. Her restraint set in motion a quiet storm that would unravel the school's toxic elite. What began as a public act of humiliation would become the rise of a leader no one saw coming, the silent girl from Chicago would soon teach the children of privilege what real strength looked like. Northgate Academy would never be the same after the girl they tried to break refused to bend. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Riya Sharma pressed her palm against the frosted window of her mother's Honda Civic, watching the imposing brick towers of Northgate Academy emerge through the Vermont snow like something from a Gothic novel. The January wind cut through her thin Chicago winter coat as she stepped onto the circular drive where expensive SUVs and luxury sedans deposited their cargo of perfectly groomed teenagers. Bundled in designer winter gear, her scholarship paperwork felt heavy in her worn leather messenger bag, a constant reminder that she didn't belong in this world of inherited privilege and legacy admissions. Remember what Nana taught you, Beta, her mother Priya said softly from the driver's seat, using the affectionate term for grandfather that had followed Riya from childhood. Strength isn't about proving yourself to others, it's about staying true to who you are. Riya nodded, touching the small silver pendant at her throat, a gift from Colonel Ajay Sharma before he deployed to his final overseas assignment. The weight of it reminded her of countless early mornings in his garage-turned-dojo, where she'd learned that discipline began not with the body, but with the mind. At 17, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent 10 years learning that true power came from control, not chaos. Her long black hair was pulled back in a simple braid, and her dark eyes held a stillness that most people mistook for timidity. The registration office smelled of old wood and fresh paint, a strange combination that seemed to capture everything about Northgate Academy, where centuries of tradition met modern expectations. Mrs. Henderson, the admissions coordinator, had the kind of practiced smile that appeared genuine until you noticed it never quite reached her eyes. "Miss Sharma, welcome to Northgate," she said, sliding a folder across the mahogany desk. "Your mother's position in our development office has certainly been a blessing for our fundraising efforts. I trust you'll find our academic standards appropriately challenging." The words carried an undertone that Riya recognized immediately, the polite acknowledgement of charity, the subtle reminder that she was here on sufferance, not merit. Despite her 4.2 GPA and her acceptance letters to 3 Ivy League schools that she couldn't afford to attend, "I'm looking forward to the challenge," Riya replied, her voice calm and measured the way Nana had taught her to speak when facing opposition. "My grandfather always said that growth happens at the edge of comfort." Mrs. Henderson's smile flickered slightly, as if she hadn't expected philosophy from a scholarship student. "How lovely. Well, you'll find that Northgate has a very particular culture, Miss Sharma. One that values tradition and appropriate behavior. I'm sure you'll adapt quickly." The uniform fitting room was a monument to precision and expense. Each piece of the required wardrobe came with specific instructions about proper wear and care. The blazer alone cost more than Riya's mother spent on groceries in a month, but it was required along with the pleated skirt, Oxford shirt, wool tights, and regulation shoes that transformed every student into a walking advertisement for conformity. "Blazer must be pressed weekly," the elderly seamstress explained as she pinned the sleeves. And the crust must never be altered or covered. These uniforms represent more than clothing. Miss Sharma, they represent belonging, Riya studied herself in the full-length mirror, seeing how the expensive fabric hung differently on her frame than it did on the girls she'd observed in the hallways back in Chicago. She'd been just another face in a sea of diversity here at Northgate. She would stand out in ways that had nothing to do with her academic achievements or her quiet strength. Her first class was Advanced Placement History with Mr. Zhao, a soft-spoken man whose reputation for fairness had preceded him through the gossip network that connected every boarding school in New England. He assigned her a seat in the third row where she could observe without being the center of attention, a position that suited her perfectly. Today, we'll discuss the concept of power structures in historical context. Mr. Zhao began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned respect rather than inherited it. Who can tell me the difference between power derived from position and power derived from character? Several hands shot up, including one belonging to a blonde girl in the front row whose blazer fit like it had been tailored specifically for her frame. Her name tag read Isla Lancaster, and everything about her posture suggested someone accustomed to being heard. Power from position is temporary, Isla said, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had never been contradicted. It depends on external circumstances. Power from character is internal and lasting. An excellent textbook answer, Miss Lancaster, Mr. Zhao replied. But how does that apply to real situations where someone with positional power abuses it? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Riya felt something stir in her chest. The same feeling she'd gotten watching her grandfather train younger students in the fundamentals of self-defense. The recognition that beneath academic discussions lay real questions about justice and courage. Sometimes, Riya said quietly, the most powerful response is refusing to participate in the abuse. The room fell silent, and she felt 20 pairs of eyes turn toward her. Mr. Zhao nodded thoughtfully, while Isla's expression shifted from polite interest to something considerably cooler. And sometimes, Miss Sharma, Isla said, her voice carrying a subtle edge, people who refuse to participate get left behind. The bell rang before anyone could respond, but as students filed out, Riya caught Mr. Zhao's eye and saw something that looked like approval mixed with concern, as if he recognized both her potential and the challenges she would face. Elena Torres found Riya in the library during lunch period, hunched over a stack of textbooks in the corner where most students never ventured. Elena had perfected the art of invisibility during her 3 years at Northgate, learning to navigate the complex social hierarchies without attracting unwanted attention. Her own scholarship status had taught her the unspoken rules that governed interactions between the haves and have-nots. You're the new girl from Chicago, Elena said, settling into the chair across from Riya. I'm Elena Torres, and before you ask, yes, I'm also here on scholarship, and yes, I know exactly what you're thinking right now. Riya looked up from her European history notes, studying Elena's face for signs of judgment or pity, finding neither. What am I thinking? You're wondering how long it takes to figure out who's safe to talk to and who's going to make your life miserable for the next semester, Elena said with a slight smile. The answer is about 2 weeks if you're observant, and the rest of your life if you're not. That's oddly specific, Riya replied, closing her textbook. I'm guessing you learned the hard way. Second week of freshman year, I made the mistake of correcting Isla Lancaster in a P English. Elena said, her voice dropping to a whisper. She'd quoted Shakespeare wrong, and I couldn't help myself. It seemed like such a small thing. But around here, small things become big things very quickly. Through the library windows, they could see the courtyard where clusters of students gathered around picnic tables. Despite the January cold, the social geography was immediately apparent to anyone who knew how to look. The athletes dominated the center tables, while the art students claimed the area near the music building. International students formed their own cluster, and scholarship students like Elena had learned to eat quickly and disappear. Tell me about Isla, Riya said, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Isla Lancaster is Northgate royalty, Elena replied. Her family has been donating to this school since before it admitted girls. Her grandmother's name is on the library. Her mother's name is on the arts center, and Isla's name will probably be on something too. If she doesn't burn the place down first. She seemed pleasant. Enough in class, Riya said, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. Isla is charming when she wants to be, Elena agreed. But she's also territorial, and she doesn't like competition, especially from people she considers beneath her. Social station, you corrected her worldview in Mr. Zhao's class, and that's not something she's likely to forget. As if summoned by their conversation, Isla appeared at their table, flanked by two other girls, whose expensive accessories marked them. As members of her inner circle, Riya recognized the calculated approach, the way predators tested new territory to determine threats and opportunities. Elena, Isla said, her voice carrying false warmth. I don't think I've met your new friend, Riya Sharma, Riya replied, standing to offer her hand the way her grandfather had taught her to meet challenges with dignity. Pleasure to meet you. Isla's handshake was firm, but brief, her eyes taking in details that most people would miss the quality of. Riya's watch, the brand of her shoes, the subtle indicators of economic status that determine social positioning. Northgate, Riya, how exotic, Isla said, the compliment carrying an undertone that made it sound like anything but. Where exactly are you from? Chicago originally, Riya replied, but my family has roots in Punjab. How interesting, Isla said, though her expression suggested she found it anything but. I love ethnic food. There's a lovely Indian restaurant in Burlington that my family visits, sometimes very authentic. The casual racism was delivered with such practiced politeness that challenging it would seem like overreaction, a technique that Riya recognized from her grandfather's stories about military politics, where discrimination hid behind professionalism. I'm sure it's lovely, Riya said, her voice remaining steady, though authenticity can be subjective depending on your reference point. Something flickered in Isla's eyes, a recognition that her subtle probe had been deflected with equal subtlety. The other girls exchanged glances that suggested they weren't used to seeing their leader's dominance questioned even politely. Well, Isla said, her smile growing sharper, I'm sure you'll find Northgate quite different from wherever you're used to. We have very particular standards here. I'm looking forward to meeting them, Riya replied, the double meaning hanging in the air like a challenge. I'm looking forward to meeting them, Riya replied, the double meaning hanging in the air like a challenge. Next morning brought the kind of Vermont snow that transformed the campus into a postcard landscape, but also made the contrast between preparation and privilege starkly visible. Riya watched from her dorm window as students emerged from the main building, some bundled in coats that cost more than her mother's monthly salary, while others, including herself, made do with layers and determination. Her roommate assignment had been strategic rather than random, pairing her with Madison Chun, a quiet girl from San Francisco whose parents had made their fortune in tech. Madison was kind but distant, the sort of person who avoided conflict by avoiding most human interaction entirely. Their room felt more like a truce than a friendship. You should be careful around Isla, Madison said as they walked to breakfast together, her voice barely above a whisper. She's nice to people when she wants something, but she has a long memory for people who cross her. I didn't cross her, Riya replied, though she was beginning to understand that at Northgate crossing someone could be as simple as existing in their space. We just had a conversation. Around here conversations are power plays, Madison said, and Isla always wins. The dining hall was a cathedral of carved wood and stained glass where students lined up for breakfast with the kind of casual entitlement that came from never having to worry about the cost of food. Riya took her usual spot at a corner table with Elena and a few other scholarship students who had formed their own quiet alliance. She's watching you, Elena murmured, nodding toward the center of the room where Isla held court at the largest table, surrounded by her usual congregation of admirers. She's been asking questions about your background. What kind of questions? Riya asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. The kind that are designed to find pressure points, Elena replied. She wants to know about your family, your finances, your academic record, anything she can use to establish dominance. Riya sipped her coffee, studying the social dynamics that played out like a carefully choreographed dance around them. Students approached Isla's table with the kind of deference usually reserved for royalty, while others gave it a wide berth, understanding instinctively that proximity to power could be dangerous for those without protection. Has anyone ever challenged her? Riya asked. Not successfully, Elena said. Last year a senior named Marcus Williams tried to report her for academic dishonesty. He'd seen her cheating on a calculus exam and thought he was doing the right thing. What happened? Marcus found himself facing a disciplinary hearing for harassment. Elena said, her voice growing tighter. Somehow Isla's friends all remembered him making inappropriate comments about her appearance, and his scholarship was reviewed for character issues. He transferred to a public school in February. The story settled over their table like a cold wind, a reminder that justice and fairness were luxuries that some students couldn't afford. Riya felt the familiar stirring of anger that her grandfather had taught her to recognize and channel, the sense that systems designed to protect the innocent were being perverted to protect the powerful. The thing about Isla, Elena continued, is that she's not just mean, she's strategic. She understands that destroying someone's reputation is more effective than physical violence because it lasts longer and leaves fewer witnesses, as if sensing their discussion. Isla's laughter carried across the dining hall, sharp and performative, followed by a comment that was clearly meant to be overheard. Some people just don't understand that charity has its place. Isla said, her voice projecting with theatrical precision. When you're given opportunities, you should be grateful, not try to prove you belong. The words hit their target with surgical precision, landing at their table like a thrown stone. Several scholarship students looked down at their plates while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Riya felt every eye in the dining hall turn toward her, waiting to see how she would respond. Elena grabbed her arm under the table, a silent plea not to escalate, but Riya had already made her decision. She stood slowly, smoothing her skirt and walking deliberately toward Isla's table, where conversation died as she approached. Isla, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence. I wanted to thank you for the advice about gratitude. It's such an important quality, especially when dealing with people who mistake kindness for weakness. The response was perfectly calibrated, polite enough to avoid confrontation, but pointed enough to make clear that the message had been received and rejected. Isla's smile faltered for just a moment before reasserting itself with renewed intensity. Of course, Riya, Isla replied. I'm always happy to help newcomers understand how things work here. I'm sure you are, Riya said, inclining her head slightly in what could have been respect or mockery, depending on the observer's perspective. Understanding systems is so important, especially when you're trying to determine whether they're worth preserving. The dining hall had gone completely quiet, now every student recognizing that they were witnessing something unprecedented, a direct challenge to the established order, delivered with such polished courtesy that it couldn't be dismissed as rudeness. Riya returned to her table, aware that she had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, but feeling oddly liberated by the clarity of her position. Elena stared at her with a mixture of admiration and terror, while Madison looked like she might faint. Well, Elena whispered, that was either very brave or very stupid. Maybe both, Riya replied, watching as Isla's table erupted in urgent whispered conversation. But sometimes you have to choose between being safe and being yourself. Across the dining hall, Beau Whitman leaned toward Isla, his expression serious as he listened to her rapid instructions. Riya couldn't hear the words, but she could read the body language, the way Isla's gestures became more animated, and Beau's jaw tightened with each directive. She had just declared war on the most powerful person in the school, and she suspected that the response would come sooner rather than later. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory, reminding her that the most dangerous opponents were often the ones who smiled while they planned your destruction. Morning classes passed in a blur of anticipation, every hallway conversation seeming to stop as she passed every cluster of students. Appearing to discuss her challenge to Isla's authority by lunchtime, the story had grown in the telling, becoming a dramatic confrontation that existed more in imagination than reality. But Riya knew that the real confrontation was still coming, and when it arrived, it would be designed to remind everyone at Northgate Academy exactly what happened to scholarship. Students who forgot their place. The afternoon brought an unusual quiet to Northgate Academy, the kind of stillness that preceded storms in the mountains of Vermont. Riya noticed it first in the way conversations stopped when she entered rooms, then resumed in hushed tones that carried the electric anticipation of impending drama. Students who had never paid attention to her before now tracked her movements through the hallways with the hungry fascination of spectators gathering for a gladiatorial contest. Elena had disappeared after lunch, claiming a sudden need to reorganize her chemistry notes. But Riya suspected her friend was avoiding association with someone who had just painted a target on her back. The abandonment stung more than she cared to admit, though she understood the survival instinct that drove it. At Northgate Academy, proximity to conflict could be as dangerous as the conflict itself. Mr. Zhao's history class felt different too, charged with an undercurrent of tension that made even the most mundane discussion of European trade routes feel loaded with meaning. Isla sat in her usual front row seat, her posture perfect and her attention seemingly focused on the lesson. But Riya caught her stealing glances backward with the calculating expression of a general surveying a battlefield. Her platinum blonde hair was pulled back in a flawless French twist, and her uniform was immaculate in a way that spoke of professional tailoring and unlimited budgets. "Miss Sharma," Mr. Zhao said, breaking into her observations with the gentle authority that had made him one of the few universally respected teachers at Northgate. "What's your perspective on how economic disparities contributed to social unrest in pre-revolutionary France?" The question was innocent enough, but in the current context it felt like a test, a deliberate probe into her mindset and intentions. Riya chose her words carefully, aware that every syllable would be dissected later for hidden meanings and reported back to interested parties. "I think," she said, meeting his eyes directly while sensing the acute attention of every student in the room, that when people in power become so insulated from consequences that they forget their responsibilities to others, they create the conditions for their own downfall. The aristocracy didn't fall because the peasants were naturally violent. They fell because they had pushed reasonable people past the point where peaceful change seemed possible. A murmur rippled through the classroom like wind through wheat. Isla's pen had stopped moving across her notebook, and several students exchanged meaningful glances that spoke of implications understood and battle lines drawn. Mr. Zhao nodded thoughtfully, but Riya caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he understood the subtext of her answer perfectly. "An interesting analysis," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "And what role do you think individuals play in either perpetuating or changing unjust systems?" The silence that followed was pregnant with expectation. 20 pairs of eyes focused on Riya with laser intensity, waiting to hear whether she would back down or double down on her implicit challenge to the established order. "Sometimes," Riya replied, feeling the weight of every gaze in the room pressing against her like a physical force. "One person has to be willing to stand up, even when it's dangerous, because that gives others permission to find their own courage. Change rarely happens from the top down. It bubbles up from people who decide they won't accept injustice anymore." Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The bell rang, cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. As students filed out, their movements seemed more urgent than usual, charged with the need to process and disseminate what they had just witnessed. Riya gathered her books slowly, aware that Isla lingered by the door in conversation with Beau Whitman. Their voices were low but urgent, and she caught fragments that made her pulse quicken with recognition. Double quotes. Tomorrow during lunch. Needs to be public. Understand her place. Bring the others. Beau nodded with the grim determination of a soldier receiving marching orders. His sandy hair fell across his forehead as he bent to listen more closely, and his broad shoulders tensed with anticipation. At 6'2" and built like the rugby captain he was, Beau represented the physical enforcement arm of Isla's social empire, the muscle that backed up her psychological warfare. That evening, Riya retreated to the quiet sanctuary of her dorm room, where Madison was conspicuously absent, probably studying in the library or finding other excuses to avoid potential conflict. The silence felt oppressive, heavy with the weight of impending confrontation. She pulled out her laptop and used the international calling card her mother had given her for emergencies, though she wasn't entirely sure this qualified as one yet. Colonel. Riya Sharma's weathered face appeared on her screen after several rings. His steel gray hair and kind eyes a comfort despite the thousands of miles and multiple time zones between them. Behind him, she could see the Spartan efficiency of his quarters at the military base where he was stationed, everything in its place and serving a purpose. "Nani," she said, using the affectionate term that had followed him through her childhood like a badge of honor. "I need advice." "I can hear it in your voice, Beta," he said, his accent carrying the authority of someone who had faced down much worse than teenage politics in places where the stakes were measured in lives rather than social standing. "Tell me what troubles you." She explained the situation carefully, from Isla's subtle provocations to the growing tension that seemed to follow her through the halls like a storm cloud. Her grandfather listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious as she described the power dynamics that governed life at Northgate Academy and the careful orchestration of the conflict that seemed to be building toward some inevitable climax. "You remember what I taught you about the difference between fighting and defending?" he asked when she finished, his voice carrying the weight of decades of military experience and martial arts mastery. "Fighting is about ego," she recited the familiar lesson that had been drilled into her since childhood. "Defending is about protecting what matters. Fighting seeks to destroy, defending seeks to preserve." "Good. And what matters here, Beta? What are you truly protecting?" Riya considered the question, thinking of Elena's frightened face and Madison's whispered warnings, of the other scholarship students who had learned to make themselves invisible rather than risk confrontation, of the freshmen she had seen humiliated in the hallway without consequence. "It's not just about me," she said finally, the realization crystallizing as she spoke. "If I let her win, if I let her break me down, it sends a message to everyone else that they should accept being treated badly. It tells them that people like us don't deserve respect." "Then you know what you must do," her grandfather said, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of someone who had made similar choices under far more dangerous circumstances. "But remember, the goal is not to defeat your opponent. The goal is to create space for justice to exist, to show others that resistance is possible." "What if justice isn't enough?" Riya asked, voicing the fear that had been growing in her chest. "What if the system is designed to protect people like her and crush people like me? Then you change." "The system," he replied simply, as if overthrowing entrenched power structures was as natural as breathing. "But you do it with honor, Beta. You become the person others can look to and say, if she can stand up, so can I. You become the first domino that shows others they don't have to fall." The next morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that made every detail sharp and significant, as if the universe itself were preparing for something momentous. Riya dressed with extra care, ensuring her uniform was immaculate, her shoes polished to a mirror shine, her hair braided with military precision. If today was going to be the day of confrontation, she would meet it looking like someone who belonged at Northgate Academy, regardless of her scholarship status or the circumstances of her arrival. The morning routine felt surreal, charged with the hyper-awareness that comes before important battles. Every interaction seemed magnified, every glance loaded with meaning. Students who had previously ignored her existence now watched her with undisguised fascination, as if she had transformed overnight from background noise into the main event. Elena found her at breakfast, sliding into the seat across from her, with the furtive movements of someone delivering intelligence behind enemy lines. Her usually bright demeanor was subdued, replaced by the nervous energy of someone who had stumbled into information she wasn't sure she wanted to possess. "Something's happening," she whispered, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard by the wrong ears. Isla's been in meetings all morning, first with Beau and his rugby friends in the common room, then with some of the senior girls in the library. They're planning something for lunch, something big. What kind of something? Riya asked, though she suspected she already knew. The patterns were too familiar, the setup too obvious for someone who had been trained to recognize. The signs of coordinated action. "The kind that involves an audience," Elena replied, her voice dropping even lower. "She's been telling people to make sure they're in the main dining hall today, claiming there's going to be an important announcement about the spring formal. But I heard Beau talking to his teammates about teaching lessons and putting people in their place." Riya nodded, finishing her coffee with deliberate calm while her mind catalogued defensive positions and exit strategies. The pieces were falling into place exactly as she had expected. Isla needed a public forum to reassert her dominance, and she needed witnesses to ensure the lesson would be remembered and transmitted throughout the school's social network. "Elena," she said quietly, reaching across the table to touch her friend's hand, "I want you to stay away from me today. Whatever happens, don't get involved. Don't try to help." "I can't just abandon you," Elena protested, her loyalty warring with her instinct for self-preservation. "We're friends. Friends don't run when things get tough. We're friends, which is why I'm asking you to trust me," Riya replied, squeezing Elena's fingers gently. "And to be ready to help afterward, if necessary. But during whatever's coming, you need to protect yourself. Promise me." Elena's eyes filled with frustrated tears, but she nodded reluctantly. "Promise me you know what you're doing." "I promise," Riya said, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was promising to. No doubt the morning classes passed in a blur of anticipation and careful observation. Riya found herself hyper-aware of every detail, the way students clustered in hallways, the frequency of whispered conversations that stopped when she approached, the subtle positioning of Isla's allies throughout the school like pieces on a chessboard. It was like watching a military operation unfold, complete with strategic positioning and coordinated timing. During third period calculus, she noticed Beau Whitman and two other rugby players entering the classroom 20 minutes late, claiming they had been called to the athletic director's office. But their positioning in the back corner and their constant glances in her direction suggested their real purpose was surveillance and intimidation. Mr. Zhao caught her after third period, his expression carrying the concern of someone who had seen too many promising students destroyed by forces beyond their control. "Miss Sharma," he said, closing his classroom door behind them to ensure privacy. "I've been teaching here for 15 years, and I recognize the signs of trouble brewing. The atmosphere in the school has changed since yesterday, and your name keeps coming up in conversations. Is there anything you need to tell me?" "I appreciate your concern," Riya said, touched by his genuine care but unwilling to drag him into a conflict that was fundamentally about student dynamics. "But I think this is something I need to handle myself. Sometimes the wisest course is to involve adults who can intervene before situations escalate," he said gently, his eyes reflecting the wisdom of someone who had navigated institutional politics for decades. "Pride can be expensive, especially when you're new to a place and don't fully understand the power structures at play." "This isn't about pride," Riya replied, meeting his gaze with the steady confidence her grandfather had taught her to project even when she felt uncertain. "It's about principle. And sometimes principles require personal risk. Sometimes they require someone to stand up and say, "This is wrong," even when it's dangerous. Mr. Zhao studied her face for a long moment, and she saw him recognize something. In her expression, a resolution that wouldn't be shaken by well-meaning advice or warnings about consequences. It was the look of someone who had already made peace with the cost of their choices. "If you change your mind," he said finally, "if things get out of hand, my door is always open. And Miss Sharma, whatever happens today, remember that how you handle it will define not just your time here, but the kind of person you become." By lunchtime, the dining hall was more crowded than Riya had ever seen it. Students who normally ate in smaller groups or skipped lunch entirely had gathered in the main room, drawn by the promise of drama or simply by the herd instinct that governs teenage behavior when something significant is about to happen. The energy was electric, anticipatory, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Riya entered alone, her head held high despite the weight of hundreds of eyes tracking her movement. She was acutely aware that every conversation paused as she passed, that every table turned to watch her progress toward her usual corner like spectators at a Roman amphitheater, watching a gladiator enter the arena. Isla sat at the center table, positioned like a queen holding court, surrounded by her usual congregation of admirers, but with additional allies positioned strategically throughout the room. The setup was professional in its thoroughness, designed to ensure maximum visibility and minimal escape routes. Beau Whitman and two other rugby players occupied a table near the serving line, effectively controlling access to food and exit. Several senior girls had claimed seats with clear sightlines to the main floor, ready to serve as witnesses and amplifiers for whatever was about to unfold. Riya took her usual seat at the corner table, opened her physics textbook, and began to read as if nothing unusual were happening. But her peripheral vision tracked every movement, every shift in the room's energy like a seismograph recording the tremors before an earthquake. Her grandfather's training had taught her to read violence before it erupted, to recognize the signs of coordinated aggression in the subtle positioning of bodies and the quality of silence that preceded action. She didn't have to wait long. Isla's approach was perfectly choreographed, timed to coincide with the moment when the dining hall reached peak capacity and maximum dramatic impact. She rose from her table with theatrical grace, her movements drawing attention like a magnet draws iron filings. Several of her friends flanked her, creating a procession that crossed the room with the slow deliberation of a ceremonial march, designed to build tension and establish dominance. "Riya," Isla said, her voice carrying clearly through the sudden quiet that fell over the room like a curtain, "I wanted to apologize for yesterday. I think we got off on the wrong foot, and that's really bothered me." The words were pitched perfectly loud, enough for everyone to hear, gracious enough to make refusing them seem churlish and ungrateful. It was a masterpiece of social manipulation, offering apparent reconciliation while actually tightening the trap. Riya looked up from her textbook, meeting Isla's eyes with steady composure that gave nothing away. "That's very kind of you," she replied, her voice calm and measured, but unnecessary. "I didn't take offense at anything you said." "Oh, but I insist," Isla said, her smile growing wider and more predatory. "You see, I've been thinking about what you said yesterday about understanding systems, and I realized you're absolutely right. It's so important for everyone to understand their place in the ecosystem, don't you think?" The dining hall had gone completely silent now, hundreds of students recognizing they were witnessing something significant, something that would be discussed and analyzed for weeks to come. The air itself seemed to vibrate with tension and anticipation. Riya closed her textbook slowly, her movements controlled and deliberate. "I'm glad we agree," she said. "Understanding systems is indeed the first step toward improving them." "Exactly," Isla said, and now her voice carried an edge that made her true. Intentions crystalline clear to everyone present. which is why I thought it might be helpful to demonstrate how things work here at Northgate. You see, we have certain standards that everyone is expected to maintain if they want to be part of our community. She gestured toward Riya's uniform with theatrical concern, her expression taking on the look of someone who had discovered something distressing and felt compelled to address it publicly. I couldn't help but notice that your blazer doesn't quite meet our dress code requirements. She continued, her voice dripping with false sympathy. The tailoring is, well, it's clearly not from our approved vendor. The fit is all wrong, the fabric quality is questionable, and everyone knows that representing Northgate properly is so important to maintaining our reputation. The attack was sophisticated in its cruelty disguised as concern for school standards, while actually targeting Riya's economic status and her family's inability to afford the expensive tailoring that marked true belonging at Northgate. It was designed to humiliate while maintaining plausible deniability, to wound while appearing to help. My uniform meets all the requirements outlined in the student handbook, Riya said calmly, though she could feel the trap closing around her like jaws snapping shut. I made sure to verify that before I purchased it. Does it though? Isla asked, moving closer with predatory grace. Beau, you're on the student council and the honor committee. What do you think about uniform standards? Don't we have a responsibility to maintain them? Beau Whitman approached with the reluctant air of someone following orders he wasn't entirely comfortable with, but lacked the courage to refuse. His rugby teammates flanked him, creating a wall of physical presence that made the confrontation feel suddenly dangerous, charged with the potential for violence. The crowd seemed to lean forward collectively, sensing that the moment of truth had arrived. Well, Beau said, his voice lacking conviction but carrying the authority of his position, the handbook does say that uniforms should be properly fitted and maintained to reflect the dignity of the institution. Exactly, Isla said, reaching toward Riya's blazer with apparent concern. This clearly isn't up to our standards. Look how the sleeve pulls here, and the way the collar sits. It's really not acceptable for someone representing Northgate Academy. Her fingers grasped the fabric of Riya's sleeve, tugging at it with theatrical concern while her eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. But Riya recognized the movement for what it was, a test of boundaries, a probe to see how far she could be pushed before she broke. Please don't touch me, Riya said clearly, her voice carrying throughout the silent dining hall with the authority of someone who had been taught to set boundaries and expect them to be respected. I'm just trying to help, Isla replied, her grip tightening on the fabric with obvious intent. You clearly don't understand how serious we are about maintaining standards here. Maybe a practical demonstration would be educational. What happened next occurred with the speed and inevitability of choreographed violence. Isla's theatrical concern transformed into deliberate aggression as she yanked hard on Riya's sleeve, intending to tear the blazer and create a scene of humiliation that would echo through the halls of Northgate Academy for years to come. Beau stepped forward as if to assist, while their audience watched in horrified fascination, some with phones already out to capture and immortalize the moment. But Riya had been expecting this moment since she'd first seen Isla's calculating expression in Mr. Zhao's classroom. As her grandfather had taught her through countless hours of training, the key to defensive action was not to resist force, but to redirect it, to use an opponent's aggression against them rather than meeting it head-on. The sound of tearing fabric echoed through the dining hall like a gunshot, sharp and final and devastating. Isla's forceful pull, meeting no resistance from Riya, who had stepped smoothly out of range, sent her stumbling backward with a piece of navy fabric clutched in her manicured fingers. The blazer hung from Riya's shoulders in tatters, the expensive fabric ruined beyond repair. How unfortunate, Riya said into the stunned silence, looking down at her torn sleeve with apparent calm that masked the fury building in her chest like a gathering storm. I suppose I'll need to have this repaired. Though I'm not sure my family's budget will stretch to replacing it entirely." The words hit their target with surgical precision, turning Isla's moment of triumph into something uglier and more naked than even she had intended. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, carrying undertones of discomfort that hadn't been there before, a sense that the display had crossed some invisible line, that the cruelty had become too visible to ignore or excuse. "Well," Isla said, trying to regain control of the narrative while still clutching the torn fabric like a trophy, "perhaps now you understand why maintaining proper standards is so important. Maybe next time you'll invest in appropriate clothing before trying to fit in somewhere you don't belong." But something had shifted in the room's atmosphere. The murmurs grew louder, and they carried a different tone than Isla had expected. Instead of the satisfied approval she was accustomed to receiving, there was something uncomfortable in the air, a recognition that they had all just witnessed something that felt less like justice and more like bullying. Riya stood slowly, her movements fluid and controlled despite the damaged uniform hanging from her frame like battle-torn armor. She looked around the dining hall, taking in the faces of her classmates, some eager for more drama, others beginning to look uncomfortable with what they had witnessed, a few showing signs of actual sympathy. "You're absolutely right about standards," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room with a quality that made everyone lean forward to listen. "They are incredibly important. The question is what kind of standards we're talking about." She shrugged out of her torn blazer completely, revealing the simple white Oxford shirt underneath. But as she moved, something in her posture shifted, a subtle change that made her seem suddenly more present, more centered, more dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with the expensive fabric that had just been destroyed. "You see," she continued, her voice remaining calm but carrying an undertone of steel that made several students shift uncomfortably in their seats, "I was raised to believe that our standards should be about character, not clothing. About how we treat people who can't defend themselves, not about how much money our families can spend on uniforms." Isla's face was beginning to flush, the color rising in her cheeks as she recognized that she was losing control of the situation, despite having executed her plan perfectly. "I don't think you understand the position you're in." "I understand perfectly," Riya interrupted, her voice still calm but carrying an authority that silenced the room more effectively than shouting could have. "I understand that you've built your entire identity around making other people feel small. I understand that you've created a system where fear passes for respect and cruelty masquerades as tradition." The dining hall was completely silent now, hundreds of students sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented, a direct challenge to the established order delivered with such controlled intensity that it felt like watching a master class in quiet revolution. "But what I don't think you understand," Riya continued, taking a step closer to Isla, who instinctively backed away, "is that some people can't be made to feel small. Some people have been taught that their worth doesn't depend on your approval, or your family's money, or your ability to destroy their possessions." Alina sat frozen at a nearby table, her face pale with worry, but her eyes bright with something that looked like hope. Mr. Zhao had appeared in the doorway, drawn by the commotion, his expression unreadable as he assessed the situation. Madison had materialized at the edge of the crowd, her usual timidity replaced by fascination. "You think you're so tough," Isla said, her voice rising with frustration and something that might have been fear. "You think you can just walk in here and challenge everything we've built? You're nothing. You're a charity case who doesn't belong here and never will." "You're right," Riya said, and her quiet agreement surprised everyone in the room, creating a moment of perfect silence. "I don't belong here. Not in this system you've created where power comes from hurting others, where strength is measured by your ability to make people afraid." She picked up her torn blazer, examining the damage with clinical detachment, while the entire dining hall waited to see what would happen next. But the thing is, she continued, her voice carrying a finality that made the air itself seem to vibrate with tension, I'm not going anywhere. And neither are the other students who've been too afraid to speak up until now. You've just shown everyone exactly who you are, Isla Lancaster, and some of them are going to remember that. Some of them are going to realize they don't have to live in fear of someone like you. The silence that followed was pregnant with possibility and danger, charged with the recognition that something fundamental had just shifted in the social order of Northgate Academy. Around the dining hall, students began to shift in their seats, whispers starting to circulate like wildfire. Some looked at Riya with newfound respect, others with concern for her safety, but none with the dismissive indifference she had faced just days earlier. Is that a threat? Isla asked, though her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence and carried an undertone of uncertainty that everyone present could hear. It's a promise, Riya replied simply, slinging her bag over her shoulder and preparing to leave the battlefield on her own terms. The promise that bullying won't go unchallenged anymore. That students like Elena and Madison and dozens of others won't have to make themselves invisible to survive. That someone is finally going to stand up and say, enough. She turned to leave, but Beau Whitman stepped into her path, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger and the desperate need to salvage something from a situation that had spiraled far beyond anyone's expectations. His broad shoulders blocked her way, and Riya could see in his eyes the dangerous combination of humiliation and violence that often preceded the worst kind of confrontations. You think you're some kind of hero? He said, his voice low and threatening, but carrying clearly through the silent dining hall. You think you can just embarrass us like this and walk away? You think there won't be consequences for this little performance? I think, Riya said calmly, meeting his eyes with the steady gaze her grandfather had taught her to maintain in the face of aggression, that you should move out of my way. The words carried no heat, no obvious threat, but something in her tone made Beau hesitate. For the first time, he seemed to really look at her, not as a victim to be intimidated or a problem to be solved, but as a person who might be capable of things he hadn't considered. Something in her stillness, in the way she held herself, suggested depths he hadn't bothered to explore. And if I don't? He asked, though his voice lacked conviction and carried the uncertain bravado of someone who had suddenly realized they might be out of their depth. Riya met his eyes directly, and in that moment, every hour of training with her grandfather crystallized into perfect clarity. The time for words had passed. The time for demonstrations had arrived. The moment she had been preparing for her entire life was finally here. Then you'll learn something new about the standards I was raised with, she said quietly, her voice carrying a certainty that made several students in the crowd take unconscious steps backward. And I don't think you're going to like the lesson. The dining hall held its breath, sensing that the next few moments would reshape everything they thought they knew about power, about fear, and about the quiet girl from Chicago who had just declared war on their entire social order. The confrontation that followed happened with the brutal efficiency of a lightning strike, swift and devastating and utterly transformative. Beau Whitman, his face flushed with the toxic combination of embarrassment and rage that often preceded violence, lunged forward with the clumsy aggression of someone who had never faced real resistance. His rugby-trained bulk and 3-year advantage in age and weight should have made the outcome inevitable, a foregone conclusion that would restore the natural order of things at Northgate Academy. Instead, what the stunned audience witnessed was a masterclass in controlled precision that would be replayed in whispered conversations for years to come. Riya's response was so fluid it seemed choreographed, as if she had been waiting her entire life for this exact moment. As Beau's hands reached for her shoulders, intending to physically intimidate her into submission, she stepped smoothly to the side and caught his extended arm in a grip that looked gentle but carried the devastating efficiency of years of disciplined training. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her mind. Use their momentum against them, Beta. Let their anger become their weakness. The arm drag technique she executed was textbook perfect, redirecting Beau's forward motion and using his own considerable weight against him. His feet tangled as she guided him past her. And what had begun as an aggressive advance became an ungraceful stumble that sent him crashing into the nearest table. The sound of dishes clattering to the floor and chairs scraping against linoleum echoed through the dining hall like thunder. "What the hell?" Beau started to say, pushing himself up from the wreckage of someone's lunch. But his words died as he turned to see Riya standing exactly where she had been before. Her posture relaxed but alert, her hands at her sides but ready. There was something in her stillness that spoke of deep training, of capabilities that went far beyond what anyone at Northgate Academy had imagined possible. "I asked you to move," she said calmly, her voice carrying clearly through the absolute silence that had fallen over the room. "I'd prefer not to ask again." The dining hall had become a frozen tableau. Hundreds of students caught between fascination and fear as they witnessed something that challenged every assumption they had made about power and violence and the girl from Chicago who had just demonstrated that appearances could be devastatingly deceiving. Isla stood with her mouth open, the piece of torn blazer still clutched in her manicured fingers, her face cycling through emotions too quickly to process. This was not how her carefully orchestrated humiliation was supposed to unfold. Beau was supposed to intimidate the scholarship girl into submission, not end up sprawled across a table, looking confused and slightly afraid. "She attacked me," Beau shouted, his voice cracking with indignation and something that might have been panic. "Everyone saw it. She attacked me." "Actually," came a clear voice from the crowd, and Elena Torres stepped forward with the kind of courage that comes from watching someone else be brave first. "What everyone saw was you trying to grab her and her defending herself. There's a difference." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, growing stronger as other students found their voices. Madison Chun appeared at Elena's side, her usual timidity replaced by something that looked remarkably like defiance. "She didn't attack anyone," Madison said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "She just didn't let herself be pushed around." More voices joined in, students who had been silent observers for years suddenly finding the courage to speak up. The carefully maintained facade of social order that had governed Northgate Academy for decades was beginning to crack, and through those cracks, truth was starting to emerge. "This is ridiculous," Isla said, her voice shrill with desperation, as she watched her authority crumble in real time. "Beau, get up, deal with this." But Beau was already back on his feet, his face flushed with humiliation and growing anger. At 6'2" and 200 pounds of rugby-trained muscle, he had never been physically challenged by anyone, let alone a girl who barely reached his shoulder. The entire foundation of his identity was built on physical dominance, and Riya had just shaken that foundation to its core. "You got lucky," he snarled, rolling his shoulders and settling into a more aggressive stance. "But luck runs out." "This doesn't have to continue," Riya said, her voice still calm but carrying a note of warning that made several students step backward. "You can walk away right now, and we can all pretend this was just a misunderstanding." "I'm not walking away from some scholarship brat who thinks she can embarrass me," Beau replied, his hands clenching into fists. "Time for you to learn how things really work around here." What happened next lasted perhaps 30 seconds, but those 30 seconds rewrote everything anyone at Northgate Academy thought they knew about Riya Sharma. Beau charged forward like a linebacker, intending to use his size and weight to overwhelm her through pure physical force. It was the kind of brutish, straightforward attack that had served him well on rugby fields and in locker room altercations where intimidation was more important than technique. Riya waited until the last possible moment, then moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent 10 years learning to turn violence into art. She stepped inside his charge, her hands moving with surgical precision to redirect his momentum. The hip throw she executed was flawless, using Beau's own forward motion and center of gravity against him in a way that sent his substantial frame airborne before depositing him on the dining hall floor with an impact that rattled windows. Sound of his body hitting the linoleum was followed by a silence so complete that the only thing audible was the soft whisper of Riya's breathing, still perfectly controlled despite having just thrown a 200-pound rugby player across the room. "Stay down," she said quietly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to give such commands. "Please." But Beau was beyond reason now, his face purple with rage and humiliation. He rolled to his feet with the desperate fury of someone who had just watched his entire worldview collapse, and he came at her again with the kind of mindless aggression that often preceded serious injury. This time, Riya's response was even more definitive. The combination she used was something her grandfather had taught her, for situations where restraint was no longer possible, a deflection that sent Beau's wild swing harmlessly past her ear, followed by a precise strike to a pressure point that dropped him to his knees, gasping and unable to coordinate his movements. "I said stay down," she repeated, though her voice now carried an edge that made several students in the crowd take another step backward. The dining hall erupted into chaos as the implications of what they had just witnessed began to sink in. Students were pulling out phones, recording video, shouting questions and commentary. Some were cheering, others looked frightened, and a few seemed to be having fundamental reconsiderations about the nature of power and who was allowed to wield it. Principal Harrington arrived at the dining hall like a force of institutional authority. His expensive suit and perfectly groomed appearance, a stark contrast to the chaos he encountered. Behind him came Mr. Zhao and two security guards, their faces grim with the recognition that they were walking into a situation that would have consequences far beyond the walls of Northgate Academy. "What exactly is happening here?" "Principal," Harrington demanded, his voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to having his questions answered immediately and completely. The response was a cacophony of voices, dozens of students trying to explain simultaneously what they had witnessed. Some painted Riya as the aggressor, others as the victim, and still others seemed more interested in describing the technical precision of her defensive techniques than in assigning blame. "Silence," Principal Harrington shouted, and the room fell quiet with the reflexive obedience that years of institutional conditioning had instilled. "Miss Lancaster, as Student Council President, perhaps you can provide a coherent explanation." Isla stepped forward, her composure carefully reconstructed, despite the visible tremor in her hands. "Principal Harrington, we were simply addressing a dress code violation when Miss Sharma became violent and attacked Beau without provocation. Several students can attest to her aggressive behavior." "That's not what happened," Alina said, her voice cutting through the silence with surprising strength. "Isla tore Riya's blazer on purpose, and when Beau tried to physically intimidate her, she defended herself." "Miss Torres," Principal Harrington said, with the tone of someone addressing a child who had spoken out of turn, "I hardly think your perspective is unbiased given your obvious friendship with Miss Sharma." "Then ask anyone else who was here," Madison Chen said, stepping forward with newfound courage. "Ask them what they really saw." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Principal Harrington's expression shifted as he began to realize that this was not going to be the simple disciplinary matter he had expected. The usual clear lines of authority and responsibility had become blurred in ways that threatened the careful balance he had maintained for years. "Mr. Zhao," he said, turning to the history teacher who had been observing the scene with thoughtful intensity, "what is your assessment of the situation?" Mr. Zhao stepped forward, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the emotional chaos surrounding him. "From what I observed arriving at the scene, it appears that Miss Sharma was responding to physical aggression with defensive techniques. Her actions appeared to be precisely calibrated to neutralize a threat without causing excessive harm. Defensive techniques? Principal Harrington repeated, his eyebrows rising. What exactly does that mean? It means, Mr. Zhao said carefully, that Miss Sharma appears to have significant martial arts training, and she used that training responsibly when confronted with a physical threat. The revelation sent another wave of whispers through the crowd. Students began connecting dots they hadn't noticed before. Riya's posture, her calm in the face of aggression, the precise way she had moved during the confrontation. Is this true, Miss Sharma? Principal Harrington asked, his voice carrying a new note of wariness. Do you have martial arts training? Yes, sir, Riya replied, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. I've been training in taekwondo since I was 7 years old. I'm a third-degree black belt. The silence that followed this admission was profound. Students who had seen her as an easy target suddenly understood that they had been catastrophically wrong in their assessment. Isla's face had gone pale as she realized the implications of having targeted someone with that level of training. And you used that training to attack Mr. Whitman? Principal Harrington continued. I used that training to defend myself when Mr. Whitman became physically aggressive, Riya corrected. Everything I did was in response to being grabbed and threatened. I never initiated any physical contact. Beau, who had finally recovered enough to stand, stepped forward with a face still flushed with humiliation. She's dangerous. She could have seriously hurt me. But she didn't, Mr. Zhao observed quietly. Despite having the capability to cause significant harm, Miss Sharma showed remarkable restraint. That level of control suggests extensive training, not just in technique, but in the ethical use of martial arts. Principal Harrington looked around the dining hall, taking in the faces of hundreds of students who were watching this conversation with intense interest. He could see the phones still recording, the social media posts that were probably already spreading beyond the school's walls, the potential for this incident to become something much larger than a simple disciplinary matter. Miss Lancaster, he said finally, is it true that you deliberately damaged Miss Sharma's uniform? Isla's carefully constructed composure finally cracked. It was just a dress code violation. She needed to understand. Is it true? Principal Harrington repeated, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority. The blazer was clearly substandard, Isla said, her voice growing more desperate. It wasn't appropriate for Northgate standards. That doesn't answer my question. Did you deliberately tear her uniform? The piece of navy fabric was still clutched in Isla's hand, damning evidence that she couldn't explain away. Around the dining hall, students watched with fascination as the girl who had terrorized them for years finally faced consequences for her actions. Yes, Isla whispered, the admission barely audible. I see, Principal Harrington said, his voice carrying a new coldness. And Mr. Whitman, did you then attempt to physically intimidate Miss Sharma after this destruction of her property? Beau looked around desperately for support, but found only the faces of students who had watched his humiliation with something between satisfaction and amazement. She was being disrespectful, he said weakly. Someone needed to put her in her place. By using physical force against a female student half your size? Principal Harrington asked, his disapproval now unmistakable. The implications of the question hung in the air like a judgment. Everyone present understood that the official narrative was being established, and it was not going to favor the traditional power structure that had governed Northgate Academy for so long. The disciplinary hearing that followed 3 days later was unlike anything in Northgate Academy's long and prestigious history. Principal Harrington had spent those 3 days dealing with phone calls from parents, reporters, and school board members as video of the dining hall confrontation spread across social media platforms with viral intensity. The footage, captured by dozens of student phones, showed the incident from multiple angles with devastating clarity. There was no ambiguity about who had initiated the conflict, no question about Riya's restraint in responding to it, and no doubt about the years of careful bullying that had created the conditions for the confrontation. Riya sat in the conference room flanked by her mother and a lawyer that Mr. Zhao had quietly recommended, facing a panel that included Principal Harrington, the school board president, and Northgate's head of student affairs. Across the room, Isla and Beau sat with their own legal representation and parents, whose faces reflected the grim reality of watching their children's carefully constructed narratives collapse under scrutiny. After reviewing all available evidence, Principal Harrington began, his voice carrying the weight of institutional judgment, including multiple video recordings and statements from dozens of witnesses. The administration has reached several conclusions. He paused, looking around the room with the gravity appropriate to a moment that would reshape the school's culture for years to come. First, Miss Lancaster, your deliberate destruction of another student's property, combined with the pattern of bullying behavior that investigation has revealed, represents a serious violation of our community standards. You are hereby suspended for the remainder of the semester, and your return will be contingent upon completing community service and anti-bullying education programs. Isla's face crumpled as the reality of consequences finally caught up with her. Her parents' influence had shielded her from accountability for years, but the public nature of this incident had made protection impossible. Second, Mr. Whitman, your attempt to use physical intimidation against a fellow student constitutes assault under both school policy and state law. You are suspended indefinitely, and the athletics department has been informed that your participation in all sports is terminated. Beau's face went ashen as his rugby scholarship and college prospects evaporated in the space of a single sentence. The identity he had built around physical dominance lay in ruins, destroyed by 30 seconds of encountering someone who understood the difference between strength and violence. Finally, Miss Sharma, Principal Harrington continued, his tone shifting to something approaching respect. While we cannot condone violence under any circumstances, the evidence clearly shows that your actions were defensive in nature and demonstrated remarkable restraint given your capabilities. No disciplinary action will be taken against you. The relief in the room was palpable, but Principal Harrington wasn't finished. However, he continued, this incident has revealed systemic problems in our school culture that require immediate attention. Effective immediately, Northgate Academy will be implementing new anti-bullying policies, mandatory diversity training for all students, and a peer mediation program to address conflicts before they escalate to violence. Over the following weeks, the changes at Northgate Academy were profound and far-reaching. Students who had spent years in silent fear found their voices, speaking up about injustices that had been ignored or covered up. The rigid social hierarchy that had defined the school began to crumble as traditional power structures faced challenges from unexpected directions. Elena Torres was elected to the student council in a special election, campaigning on a platform of inclusivity and accountability. Madison Chun started a support group for scholarship students, creating networks of mutual aid and protection that hadn't existed before. Even students from wealthy families began questioning systems they had previously taken for granted. Riya became something of a legend, though she wore that status with the same quiet dignity she had shown throughout the crisis. Students would nod respectfully when she passed in the hallways, not from fear but from genuine respect for someone who had stood up when standing up mattered. You changed everything, Elena told her one afternoon as they studied together in the library that had once felt like a refuge from hostility, but now felt like a normal part of school life. I didn't change anything, Riya replied, looking up from her calculus homework. I just refused to accept something that was wrong. The change came from everyone else finding the courage to do the same thing. Her grandfather's words echoed in her memory during their weekly video calls. The strongest steel is forged in the hottest fire, Beta. You faced your test and proved what you were made of. But perhaps the most significant change was in how students understood power itself. The old model based on wealth, intimidation, and social status had been replaced by something more complex and ultimately more just a recognition that true strength came not from the ability to hurt others, but from the courage to protect them. Mr. Zhao, observing these changes from his classroom, reflected on the lesson he had been trying to teach about individual action and systemic change. Sometimes he realized the most important education happened not in textbooks, but in moments when someone chose to stand up for what was right, regardless of the personal cost. As winter gave way to spring at Northgate Academy, the snow melted to reveal ground that was ready for new growth. The school that had once been defined by toxic traditions and entrenched privilege was slowly becoming something different, a place where character mattered more than connections, where justice was more important than maintaining the status quo. Riya Sharma, the quiet girl from Chicago who had arrived on a scholarship and carrying her grandfather's lessons about honor and courage, had kept her promise. She had created space for justice to exist, and in doing so, she had shown an entire community that change was possible when someone was willing to stand up and say, enough. The bullies who had tried to tear her down had indeed made a big mistake, not because she was a black belt fighter, but because she was something far more dangerous to systems built on oppression. She was someone who refused to be broken, and who inspired others to find that same unbreakable strength within themselves. In the end, the greatest victory was not the 30 seconds of physical dominance in the dining hall, but the years of positive change that followed, proof that sometimes the most important battles are won not with fists, but with the simple decision to stand up for what is right, no matter the cost. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.